Welcome to the CPTM Smart Partners Hub, and as we announced Friday and a few days before, today we have with us Professor Sheila Ronis and a number of smart partners, and the discussion will be about how to carry forward visions. National visions, regional visions, global visions. And as we know, CPTM and Smart Partnership Movement is associated with national visions for more than 20 years. And I will only flag a few visions from some of our national hubs who called me in the last week or so to try to ensure that Sheila is paying attention to their vision. And this is from Botswana, the Vision 2016, and I start with that because the 20 years since Botswana Vision 2016 started, it kind of reached a point and going beyond that. The Vision 2020 of Mauritius, the Vision 2022 of His Majesty in the Kingdom of Swaziland, Tradition and Modernity, the Lesotho Vision 2020, and there will be many others that we were able to discuss a little bit before this webcast so that we put the context of the discussion and the value. The main reason why we invited Sheila was because in the last 2 years, CPTM is part of the World Future Society for a number of years, but in the last 2 years, the Foresight group related to World Future Society has been focusing a little bit more in relation to how to achieve foresight, how to ensure that the government structures and private sector and otherwise civil societies and academia, they are infusing vision processes. And of course networks, issues connected with complexity, and issues connected particularly with a strategic integration, if possible. Those are issues for about 20 years that CPTM members are also grasping with. So we have with us Andrew Tausig, to start from this side, Director of CPTM, Chris Pastakia, founder member of CPTM before, an environmentalist, and Mike, a new recruit in our Mike Brockbank, formerly in IBM, Professor Bruce Lloyd, very well known in long-range planning and world future, Robert Smith, who is a CPTM networking member but specialized in nuclear and energy issues, and we have Lady Dowding, who is a typical CPTM networking member. But on behalf of a number of High Commissioners in London, Smart Partners, we have Her Excellency High Commissioner of Uganda, Joyce in the library, as we call, and we have the representative of the High Commission of Namibia from Namibia. But otherwise, quite a number of calls, quite a number of emails have been received from Ambassador Professor Sam Tulia-Muhika, who asked for me to mention. He is in Mogadishu right now and has a number of questions and a number of other contributions from St. Lucia, etc. So Sheila was brought in our group through, or I was bringing her background, unique background actually, in our group, through a book that she's not very happy that I mentioned. I wouldn't be happy too, because it was written a number of years ago, and it was only an expression of the much work that is being done for quite a number of years, and experience, real-time experience, timelines into the future, strategic vision methods for government, business and organizations. But this was a stimulus for our own smart partnership movement and CPTM to try to look to a number of other things and look forward to the today discussion. The World Future Society and the public sector Foresight just finished their annual meeting in Washington this year, and I was very, very glad, Sheila, that together with Dr. Leon Fouet, who is also very well known in the relation to anticipatory governance, and so on, that you've been able to pay attention to also our own preoccupations and our own problems. So, could you please try to go through at least part of what you mentioned here, but what is today? This was in 2006?
Six, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So today we are 2016, so
right.
A lot of things happen.
A lot of things have happened over the last 10 years.
A lot of things you want to happen.
Yes. Well, let me begin by saying my name is Sheila Ronis. I am a professor and chair of the Department of Management at Walsh College in Troy, Michigan. I also hold a special term appointment with Argonne National Laboratory, part of the U.S. Department of Energy, and run for them by the University of Chicago. But all of my comments today are my own opinions and work, and do not express the position of the United States government. What I'm going to share with you is really the work since the writing of Timelines into the Future, which was an impetus for many organizations in the United States, within the U.S. government, but also in the private sector, and other organizations. Many nonprofits have also, I know, worked with me and have used the fundamentals that are in this book. And so let me go through some of my ideas with you, so you'll get a better understanding of where we are and where we hope to go in the near future. In 2008, the Project on National Security Reform, which was a congressional commission, included a vision working group, one of 10. And this was a massive overhaul and study of the United States national security system that provided the Congress recommendations for how to completely reconfigure what our national security system needed to look like for a 21st century world, since it had not fundamentally changed since the National Security Act of 1947. And even with Goldwater-Nichols Act, which required jointness within the Pentagon, we now needed to look beyond defense and look more broadly at what national security looked like today, and just how interconnected all the elements of national power are, and develop an appropriate system for that. And the Vision Working Group recommended that there be more interagency and intergovernmental collaborative process capabilities within the White House. And the Center for Complex and Strategic Decisions is a prototype of what that might look like, so that we could develop some proof of concept. It is also based on the work of Professor Leon Firth, who was at George Washington University and the National Defense University. And Professor Firth worked on something called the Project on Forward Engagement, looking at a whole of government approach called anticipatory governance. His philosophies and theories have informed not only my work, but the work that he and I are continuing to do together as we move forward in developing these proof of concepts. Professor Firth was in the White House for 8 years during the Clinton-Gore administration, and he served as the National Security Advisor to the Vice President at that time. In 1990, I read the U.S. National Security Strategy for the very first time. It was also the very first time that I realized as a citizen that there was nothing to hang it onto. When I think of strategy, I think of something that's hierarchical. And if you develop a national defense strategy or a national foreign policy, you need to attach that to a national policy or strategy of some sort. And it was really the first time that it became clear to me that the United States did not have any such document, and nor did it have any such process as a major part of how it conducted its affairs from day to day. In fact, more than 25 years ago, I then decided it was time for me to think about what would happen if the United States actually could develop such a process, a system, and a strategy. And that's when my work really began in earnest. This continues, unfortunately, to be the case. We don't develop grand strategies, and of course, a big part of this process is to figure out methods and mechanisms. And the Project on National Security Reform was a perfect vehicle to really examine that issue. In the private sector, as a professor of management in a business school, of course, I've been involved in how the private sector uses management tools. Some organizations use them better than others, but it was, why can't we do this in the U.S. government in particular? And that has been a part of what I hope will be almost a technology transfer from private sector to public sector, at least in terms of best practices. And so the real question is, what mechanisms should the U.S. government develop to do this? And that's an easy question, but it doesn't have any easy answers. Because the U.S. security is rooted in the successful integration of all elements of national power. And it's my understanding from my work that because of the methods of financing our federal government, especially through the congressional committee structure to the executive branch, there are clear limitations as to what we can and cannot do, what we call the colors of money, which have to do with who the money belongs to and who can spend that money, who has the authority to spend that money. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that arena that we have begun to talk about, but we haven't really addressed yet. And what is the basis for rethinking the national security system? And our working group defined national security in a very broad sense to look at the health and stability of all elements of national power, not just the traditional military establishment or military intelligence establishment, because that simply isn't sufficient. And the national security system, therefore, we defined very, very broadly. Although it came with a price, which is a lot of people were leery and didn't understand, and because it didn't conform to their belief system, it has provided a lot of challenges to us. But I think it's necessary either way. And the system scientist in me knows that we can't separate out these issues. They are intertwined. And so if you don't even make an attempt to understand the interconnections and interrelationships, you get into trouble. From the system scientist perspective, the national security system in the United States is a complex adaptive system, whether we say so or not. So I think we might as well say so. And then really step back and say, okay, now what does that really mean? What are the characteristics of complex adaptive systems so that we can deal with them in the real world? So we went out and identified a few of the characteristics. You have to be able to share information and collaborate horizontally in such a system. You have to accommodate unanticipated needs and partnerships, and frequently those that you haven't considered before. You need to ensure agility in the face of uncertainty. There's no other way to describe it. You need to incorporate ad hoc structures and processes. And, perhaps most important, you need to maintain a long-term view. And that has been a very difficult task for us in the United States. But it is not just an understanding of complex systems. You have to understand that most of the messy problems that we address today are composed of complex systems of complex systems. And the military feels very comfortable with the notion of systems of systems. And that's because they deal with complicated systems like weapon systems. But they are only complicated. They are not complex. And when you add the complexity into the equation, you're dealing with a very different animal. And one of those characteristics of complex systems is you cannot predict and control what is going on inside the system. Well, you tell that to a military general and they don't want to believe it. But the reality is, in a complex system, you can't predict the behavior, nor can you control what's going on inside it. So you have to really understand the dynamics of that system if you expect to affect any change at all. I find it very troubling that most policymakers don't understand anything about complexity. They don't understand it's a natural phenomenon in the real world. And I think scientists, probably like me, have done a dreadful job of articulating why that matters to a policymaker. And there's an enormous amount of work, though, that needs to occur to make that real. But I've stopped trying to explain it in terms of the laws of thermodynamics, which is natural for a physicist to want to do. Because the laws of thermodynamics are difficult to understand. They include a tremendous amount of mathematics. And so we tried to find ways within the English language to describe complex systems. And they may not work as well as some would like, but I think they're better than trying to just, give a lot of equations and explain it that way. So that we start with the most important premise, which is complex systems can't be controlled. The good news is they can be influenced. But they can only be influenced if you understand them intimately. I mean intimately. And so you really have to have a method to understand things in a very deep way. And from the standpoint of the U.S. government, we said, we have a lot of people with a lot of knowledge within the United States government, in the State Department, in the entire military intelligence establishment, but somebody needs to coordinate that. And we really need to create a method to do that. And honestly, in a 3-branch of government representative democracy, we don't have a prime minister, but we do have capabilities within the executive office of the President of the United States. So that's where we think the center needs to exist. Subsequent to the project on national security reform, it has become clear to us it is also necessary in the other 2 branches of government. And we're just beginning now to do the kinds of studies that are necessary to determine where this capability would need to reside in those branches. But we don't have very many answers yet. We hope we're asking the right questions. The reason for that is we need to find methods to synthesize all of government's solutions to complex system issues and problems, and sometimes all of society. And I put solutions in quotes for a reason. and that's that very few complex system issues have solutions. And they certainly don't have one solution. They may have multiple solutions. And sometimes the best you can hope for is to ameliorate a situation, to make it better. But to actually solve a problem is impossible. Now, we think that foresight is a key component of our approach because in a story, you can illustrate systemic effects and you can illustrate complexity without forcing somebody to have to learn the physics and mathematics of why it is the way it is. But you can explore in a story and you can learn in a story. And one of the most important elements of complexity is you need to be in a continuous learning mode of what is going on inside the system if you want to have an impact on that system. So we have created what we call visionarios, which are very in-depth stories that they use disciplined foresight processes, but they also marry them to the science of complexity and systems, to the point where now we're trying to actually build complexity science algorithm models at Argonne to reflect and test different assumptions in a complex system, agent-based models. And it's a very powerful tool, and it can enable you to improve and inform public policy decisions. There are 5 general questions that we almost always ask of the visionario. What are the stressors in the scenario? Was the system able to anticipate the problems described? How well was the system able to react? How well was the system able to recover? And how well does the system function as a whole? And these are just pretty basic, but imperative to answer. Discussion questions that then these lead to include how will any recommendations function? Because this is really important to ask so that you can think about, once you decide on a course of action, how will it function? How will it work? Are there problems or solutions identified that we haven't addressed? And if this future isn't desirable, what choices should we be making today to avoid it? Because this is a step that we frequently never get to as we work with various scenarios. And yet it's one of the most crucial, because we don't really think of, should we have a contingency here? And how do we develop that contingency? And maybe one contingency isn't enough. Maybe we need 2, 3, or 4 contingencies. Brexit is a perfect example where someone should have gamed Brexit so that they went on television and said and explained to the people who were voting, here are some data, we developed these models, and we have a general understanding of what might happen if we go this route, and here are other models that say what also may happen, so that you can look at second, third, and fourth order effect of decisions, because so rarely those systemic elements are just never considered. And it can be catastrophic.
Right.
Well, quickly describe our vision for the center is to use the application of advanced systems approaches to ameliorating complex problems and improving policy and strategy decision making. Not solving problems, but improving them, ameliorating them. And our mission is to provide the capability through the systems level integration of foresight, insight, and strategic leadership models with high-powered complexity science and decision technologies over time. And of course, there are many, many tools in the tool set. And what you need to do is use the right tool at the right time for the right set of circumstances. Because there's no one set of tools that is going to get you where you need to go every time. One of the things I wanted to describe was the fact that we think maneuvering within the complexity of today's world requires strategic thinkers who have the ability to understand nonlinear and unintended consequences of their policies and decisions. This is really critical in a world of complexity, and we frequently describe it to our policymakers in the United States as the West playing chess and the East playing Wei Qi or Go, and neither group understanding why, when they're trying to work together, they're playing by different sets of rules, cultures, worldviews. And this is very helpful in describing why so frequently you can have disastrous effects simply through misunderstanding. So the rigorous framework that we are using includes near, mid, and long-term planning, because you can't leave any of them out. Right now we're in a project format. Obviously that would change if we became a function of the U.S. government. And actually we're hoping, at least for the executive branch, that we will reside in the executive office of the president. We can be in the Office of Management and Budget. We could be in the national security staff. There are many different places within the White House complex that we could go, but it's important, we think, to be associated with the office of the president. Another part of this framework is that we have to go all the way from deep space to cyberspace and everything in between, from 1 year to more than 50 years. I think we need to go even beyond that to a century, maybe 2 or 3. In the East, I have seen plans that go out 250 years. And of course, they are not plans in the sense that they have ends, ways, and means, but they are statements of philosophy that I think would be extremely useful to engage our citizens in. And we're not doing enough of that at all. And the global localization spectrum refers to the nested systems from global down to local that interface with one another, and that frequently you don't think about, especially when you're doing a national plan. And yet you have to understand your relationship in the global system and your relationship at the national level to the local system. And the more you understand those interdependencies up and down that chain, that hierarchy, the more likely you will make better decisions. You also have to understand risk. Risk is an enormous part of this equation, and it's a huge part of what public policy people must calculate. But it isn't enough to say this is the economic risk associated with this decision, because no calculation of risk is independent of all the other areas of risk. And so you really have to look systemically at risk and at the interdependencies between different kinds of risk in a system. And obviously visioning processes, for me, also require a very rigorous process, which is outlined in the Timelines book. Perhaps a better description is how we used this process in the Project on National Security Reform, which is outlined in that book and is available online and can be downloaded for free. Everything other than the Timelines book are in the public domain, so you can use anything from them. We would just ask kindly if you would give us attribution. So how did we do this? Well, I started by creating a number of partnerships, because it was the only way that a small group of people could really leverage the kind of knowledge and capabilities that I needed. I was fortunate to work with Pam Sedelko, the director of the Systems Science Center at Argonne National Laboratory, which is run by the University of Chicago for the U.S. Department of Energy. And her Systems Science Center does some of the most creative activity I've ever seen at a national laboratory. It's just amazing. And their willingness to partner with small players like me has been wonderful, because their modelers can do things and have equipment and expertise that, of course, a little business school in the Midwest in the United States would not have. We are also partnering with Georgia Tech. Dr. Dimitri Mavris and his Aerospace Systems Center also looks at, they are system risk people. They have done a tremendous amount of work for industry and government, and fabulous models as well. The Universidad Rey Juan Carlos in Madrid has a master's program in intelligence, and it has been a very interesting laboratory for me to work on strategic visioning methodologies, and I actually teach a course in their graduate program on that. I am doing work with the government of Finland, Tekas, and the Ministry of Employment and the Economy, and the Ministry for Foreign Affairs for Trade, and very soon we're going to be we're going to repeat a process that I worked on with these people for the other ministries within Finland. And it's just another opportunity for me to take a system and try these out, because of course a lot of what we're doing is experimental. I was fortunate to have a Fulbright to the government of Singapore, in which I was able to study the risk assessment and horizon scanning processes of the country through their Prime Minister's office. And it was just another part of the really understanding some of the best practices in the world, since they are a tremendously forward-looking country that not only is able to use foresight, but then to implement strategies based on that foresight. In Nahalal, Israel, the Galilee International Management Institute, we have done some projects with Dr. Chevelle, who is the president there, that have been very interesting, that included the government of Israel. And a few specific examples: forging an American grand strategy, securing a path through a complex future. This was a seminar that was put on at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., in which we actually pulled together people from across the entire government spectrum and put together a notional grand strategy of the United States. And we said, if we had one, what would it look like? So we tried it out. Energy security as a grand strategy is another one that we did with the National Defense University and the Department of Energy. So we were able to bring together different parts of our federal government and put together a visionario in which we took down the United States energy grid in a cyber attack and really explored the second, third, and fourth order effects of that and what might emerge afterwards. And what was so wonderful about this one is that it informed Plenty at Stake, which was a 113th Congress publication on energy policy. And so we were the number one, we were the first citation in the document, and we were very excited that they really read our paper from cover to cover. For the General Accountability Office, I put together a visionario for the nano-manufacturing forum that they had, and when you look at the final document, many of the ideas that emerged from the visionario are clearly in the recommendations that they have made to Congress. Israel at 100, a scenario in 2048, was one of the projects we did for the Galilee International Management Institute, in which we were able to bring together various parts of the Israeli government and a number of civilian organizations and individuals to discuss sensitive topics. Chicago Story, which was for the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, was a very interesting project where we were looking at drug utilization in the gangs of Chicago and their relationship to the global drug cartels. And, well, let's just say we learned a great deal about the relationship between two different networks, and we didn't realize how related they were. I have been documenting some of my lessons for OECD in Paris, and they have become quite a partner as they're trying to share some of our successes with their membership. And we continue to work with the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute, their Wargaming and Simulation Center, and others at the U.S. Army War College to inform a number of Army policies with regards to the use of visionarios that go beyond the traditional wargaming and simulations that they do to look more broadly at issues that they are wrestling with. The National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, we were part of their Foresight initiative in which we developed 2 visionarios, which I cannot share with you, but it was fun. It was more than fun. We all learned a great deal. Obviously, the School of International Futures, which is why I'm in the UK this week, I will be working with Kat Tully, and I will be presenting in 2 days. And, of course, Professor Leon Firth I continue to work with on all the elements of our center. He has been a collaborator and partner that has just been so useful because of his enormous experience, not to mention his intellect, but his ability to really understand what it's like in the White House on a day-to-day basis and what we need to do, what kinds of things we have to be capable of in order to improve things. Because shaping the future, of course, is what all of this is about. And if you can shape them in your favor, that is really what is the ideal. Okay, so there are 3 different email addresses, as well as our website at Walsh College, but I think the second one is probably the best for you to reach me at. And if you need a government email, I have one of those too, because sometimes that's the only way that government officials can send me things. And with that, I want to thank you all for your kind attention, and I would be delighted to hear your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sheila, the kind of humble way you presented the kind of environment that usually we do not quite bring in, although is always there. National security understood as defense rather than national security, economic security.
Right.
Is probably the first time that we do it in a most professional way. And when one refers to US and White House and so on, is a big brother, you don't talk about it, and they don't say they can't do things. So I think the way you presented the whole thing is most kind of robust. And it was for you a bit of a stretch to come down to us who are dealing with actually under national security, with financial inclusion, with central banks, with standards, and which are brought in as a strategic player, with data and statistics, with, of course, science, technology, and so on. But the national visions within our context, obviously they are complex adaptive systems, and right from the beginning in 1995, the reason why we were set up as a complex, but otherwise very simple, cooperative framework was because it was an expression of the national visions at the national level.
Yeah.
And there is a continuous kind of hope that there are ways and means to integrate better interagencies.
Yes.
But more than that, private sector, hybrid organizations, and population. What we've done in our case, was to highlight this smart partnership ethos and smart partnership principles which emerged and which allowed actually the interactivity and the participation to actually reply a little bit to some of the questions you were talking about, because the smart partnership dialogues and think tankings that are taking place in a most participative way you could think of allows actually, if they are done regular at the national level and otherwise, allows a number of these scenarios, a number of updates to take place, and also to monitor a systemic risk in the country. But the question is, there is no center that can monitor and pick up the pulse that is taking place. But otherwise, the Smart Partnership and CPTM is practicing quite a lot of this in real time, but it's not monitoring that particular pulse, that is feedback that is coming up from the interactions. But
you could.
Yeah, but we could, and this was the reason why we brought you here. But thank you very much once again for stretching out from the usual national security kind of environment that you are working in, and these are kind of coming from the environment. But in the civil applications, it's a very good point of reference. So
it's worth saying that of the things that we have focused on, which have a somewhat more economic development
security
focus,
standards,
raising standards, financial inclusion, and the processes of technological information feeding in science and so on. These are all, in the broadest sense, aspects of security.
Absolutely.
I mean, they're not security like NSA, but they're security in a very important sense, and all these things interact. The other question I was going to ask was, you've been taking examples from the United States of America, the world's most powerful and developed country, and selective smaller countries, all of which have a very high level of development, Israel, Singapore and Finland. Thinking of our concerns here, and not just of the High Commissioner and Namibia and so on, but all of us are concerned with these issues. The average level of economic development and potential and resource of the countries we are concerned with, which Africa, Caribbean, so on, Asia, can we glean any hints as to how one could begin? Because the issues you raise are so huge, and the word operationalizing, where does one start? Well, you've got to start somewhere always.
But they already started.
Yes, but in terms of applying the lessons that you have expounded to countries where the level of resource, I don't like the word development, the level of available resource
is small. Yes. I think that the general lessons that are falling out of all this work are that it doesn't matter what level of a system you are working at, the lessons still apply. So if you are working on a micro-lending project to improve economic security of a neighborhood or a region, they can stabilize that region just like a massive project might stabilize a region that has a lot of unrest. Some of the areas that we have looked at, one of the things I didn't have in my examples was economic security, the neglected dimension of national security.
Yes, exactly.
Which was another one of the conferences, by the way, that I had at the National Defense University. And that also is available online for download. But I think what I'm learning from all of these experiments and projects is that, Finland is a country of 5 million people. I look at Singapore, which is a country of 5 million people. These are not large geographically or population-wise organizations. They are developed, but Singapore wasn't developed when I was born, and so they have learned how to effectively determine grand strategy for the nation that they could then execute and create an economic powerhouse. Can you learn a lot from studying Singapore? You bet you can. Starting with their water independence strategy, how they designed it, how they executed it, and how it really became a driver for other strategies that they then put in place. And I think that what is important, the physicist in me understands complex social systems a little differently than the sociologist in me. And the management professor in me sees different elements. But all of them together look at this and say, is this rocket science? No. And I can say that. I once was a rocket scientist. But the reality is, it does require an understanding of all of the stakeholders in the system, whether the system is a community and a tribal leader or elder that you must deal with, or whether the community is a very large country that has a parliament and a prime minister's structure or a president's structure that you have to understand.
But Sheila, before Bruce comes in, the government structure that they are in Lesotho is small. It's much smaller than 5 million.
Yes.
Or they are wherever they are, or they are in Nigeria, or they are in Uganda, or they are in UK. The government, isn't it, that they have a kind of late 18th century type of structures.
The United States has an 18th century structure too.
So the question is that this kind of centers might actually stimulate
I think
complete
so. Oh, absolutely.
change. The problem is there evolution or is an evolution if you put that center in a president or prime minister's office? How do you get it? But Bruce, how do you get it going?
A very interesting discussion of a lot of the issues which are extremely important. I just wonder about the difference between operating in an essentially cooperative structure, which many of these countries that have been relatively successful have,
Yes.
and a basically highly competitive culture, or both inside the country and between countries. Because just to use a soccer analogy, it only works because you have agreement on the rules,
Right.
you have an independent referee,
Yes.
which is now considered to be an independent profession, which is considered to be completely separate from the players. Now, what is it where it's relatively easy to operate what you're talking about within a cooperative culture? The real challenge is how do you really make it work in a highly competitive culture? And how do you work out how to develop this profession of referees within that agenda?
I cannot say that I have used the process, for example, to bring the Palestinians and the Israelis together. I have not. Okay. What I did do, though, was I took a United States Institute of Peace process, and I used it to bring the management of General Motors and their union together to talk. In fact, it's documented in Timelines into the Future.
That is.
And one of the members of my team, Dr. Richard Chasdy, is a international specialist in negotiation and reconciliation. And we use many of his tools and techniques in addition to those that I have developed, which I've only really used in industry. I haven't used them as much. But I find that almost all of the institutions and organizations, even within a government, have multiple political viewpoints and agendas when they attend a visioning session. And the general rules by which you operate a visioning session are as relevant to them as they were to the people at the United States Institute of Peace who did develop them for warring nations. That is part of our visioning process, because if you don't start with a clear set of rules for how you develop the visions, listen to all of the stakeholder viewpoints and respect them, you never make any progress at all.
I'm trying to drag you to trying to get to the High Commissioner's question, and that is how, when, then would you advise her, and hence her government, as to the institutional arrangements that she might look at?
It's contextual.
It's contextual, and it would, I would start with a system map.
Yeah.
Right.
You need to know what are the forces inside your country, what are the regional African forces,
That's external, yeah.
internal, external, and all of the stakeholders. Who are the key stakeholders? They can be warlords, they can be clansmen, they can be I don't know the details of your government, but you have to really look at who do people respect, who do they go for with disputes, whether it's at a local level or a regional level. You have to understand your system intimately. And if I were you, I would document it by bringing as many of those people into a room as you can have.
This is what actually did happen in Botswana. When the Botswana Vision 2016 this year will go probably to the next phase, same vision, but initially there was, Secretary Wansier was president, and they took about 2 years to identify who are those who need to be involved and what language they speak, including Tswana and all the rest of it. How do they express these visions? So this is what made them they lasted 20 years. You said it's too... It wasn't. It was 50 years anniversary.
Yes.
About 20 years ago, 20 years ago. 50th anniversary of independence of Botswana. And the only problem that they haven't been able to answer was, how do you say that the vision has been achieved? And the question is, this vision is, as you said, progress.
Right.
Yeah,
Whenever you look
progress.
at your vision, if you've already done it, it's no longer your vision.
Then,
You have to look out to the next vision. And by having an iterative process that never ends.
That's
Yes.
it.
I think that's the key.
That's very difficult to
Have a
understand.
plan,
Okay.
stick to the plan, change the plan, stick to the plan. And,
Absolutely. Because the world changes and you have to change with it. And hopefully, if you want to shape
You have any-
the outcomes, you have to really get out. And you have to always be living
Yes.
out and thinking about the long-term effects. The indigenous American Indians used to say that the elders' councils would not make a decision unless they understood how it affected 7 generations. Seriously, this is part of American Indian culture and lore. And of course, Americans just threw it all out. So it never inculcated itself into our value system. But there are many people who today think it is absolutely essential on a planet of as many billions as we have, because now we really are making decisions that will seriously affect not only the next generation, but we don't even know how it's going to affect 7 generations out. And yet it's that kind of thinking that we really should have top of mind as we consider things that are going to affect people. In the United States, I will tell you at least amongst the public servants who I work with, they take that kind of thinking very seriously because they know many of the decisions they make will in fact affect every man, woman, and child on the planet. And I think it's important that all of us think that way.
The thing is that the network of personal relationships is essential.
Well, you don't have a network unless you have a network.
Good organization, analytics, and anything else.
Yeah.
Mihaila has a statement, nothing is done until it is done.
So, we demonstrated for 20 years, not we, the movement demonstrated that irrespective of how odd some situations may have appeared, the thing is that we were able to adapt to whatever context. And the only reason why is because there was this personal wish for everybody who is part of their network, to be there when they are needed. So it's quite essential that to be put into a 21st century government structure. So we jump from 18th century to 21st century. What Leon Furth says is about this kind of
anticipatory governance.
Yeah, and networked government. But
I think that's probably
the
word vision is.
But you see, networked government is an anti. There are two.
Yes,
networked is.
It's a contradiction in terms, slightly.
The governance is perceived as a formal structure,
right?
Where you cannot necessarily network. So what the vision might be able to do, the vision process, is to combine both. But how do you achieve that?
Well, by first saying that governance
with energy
can
monopoly.
well, but governance should be flexible, and governance needs to be ever changing, and nothing can be rigid in the 21st century the way it was in the 18th century, because it's not going to survive.
But I think this phrase national visions is a phrase that in the movement we've used, because we've had a great sense of here we are at a particular point, and I hate the word development, but here at a particular point we want to get to another point on behalf of certain countries. So this is the vision. I think it conveys a certain rigidity, and I like what you said, vision process is actually a more useful thing to be saying, because otherwise vision's becomes like a sort of, I'm a schoolmaster and I'm giving you points for how close you are to the vision, and I have no right to do that,
Why did you refer to it as a center, as different from, we try to avoid to say centers.
Yes.
We're saying networks, webs, nodes, hubs, and so on, links. And you did actually, all your philosophy and everything else is based on that.
Yes.
But then, did you say center because it had to be the center? Or did you say center because it's, what did you say?
I want it to be a concentration of capabilities.
That's it.
And I think that the U.S. government needs a concentration of capabilities in the executive, in the legislative, and in the judiciary branches of government, because today we do not have that concentration anywhere.
And I suppose that is what is happening everywhere. It's happening in most of the countries.
Well, and it's been my observation doing the Singapore Fulbright and the work with Finland and the work with Israel is correct. Everyone on the planet who is thinking is worrying about these issues.
But it sends the right signal. I mean, if you called it the something foundation, immediately someone would think, it's got a latter-day Steve Jobs or someone actually is running it. And actually the whole point is that it is for the whole community. And you can't split it between the Congress, the Supreme Court, and the executive branch. So the best.
They all need to have it. They all need to have the capability. And in the United States government, you don't consider giving any one of the branches a set of capabilities without giving it to the other branches. Because remember, one of our main tenets of setting up the government was that no one could have power over the others.
That's it. Well, I mean, this is the idea in smart partnership, actually.
Yeah.
We were always
whole
we were
movement.
so afraid King
Yeah.
George was going to come back and hurt us.
But you have to be watching all the time, because your Rand Corporation question, which is you don't want to be like the Rand Corporation or the Aspen Foundation or anything. You've got to be watching all the time that you don't make a move or an appointment which enables someone to say, hey, Sheila's wonderful concept, it's being polluted or diverted into thinking. You've got to be vigilant, haven't you, all
Well,
the time?
and even to the fact where, for the project on national security reform, yes, I worked with Professor Leon Firth, but I also worked with General Brent Scowcroft. So I had a strong Republican perspective and a strong Democratic perspective. Those two gentlemen were my two major advisors because they had both lived in the White House. They both knew the operations of the National Security Council, and they both understood the global context within which the White House performs on a day-to-day basis. And the only time any American citizen has that peak or that view is if they are in the White House with the Chief Executive Officer of the United States making decisions on a day-to-day basis. And I needed both sides of the aisle too. So trust me, if we end up being a think tank on our own, you're going to have, if I have 24 board members, 12 will be Republicans, 12 will be Democrats, because that's how you have to function in Washington if you want to stay above the fray.
Well, I just hope that the center will become a physical manifestation. In addition to the fact,
Yeah,
it's already
we're not-
there.
we're not-
It's
we're
already
not yet,
there, but literally the intervention you made now, it came at a very, very opportune time for both Vision 2016 and all sorts of other national visions, because in the last 2 years or so, most of these processes that evolved, and
Yes.
we were very much part of it, in the last 20 years actually, they reach a point where either they are being hijacked by the ministries of national planning,
Yes?
led by them, and therefore is no more a vision, becoming a national
Right.
planning delivery. Yeah. Or they say, well, we've done what we've done, why don't we move out and set up a council where, it's no more part of the mainstream.
Yes.
Yeah. Or if they have got, as most of the democracies, they've got elections and they changes.
Yes.
Well, there is a completely new vision that is being established, and it may not be
Right.
going the same way. So there are about 25 or so different situations, and each country has its own situation, but that will have been following
Yes.
or stimulating to happen. So I think probably we have a lot of evidence of the kind of things that stories,
Yes.
the kind of things a center, and the kind of things that, how would I say, a guide could be put together, based on ongoing think tanking and so on to
Yes.
the respective countries. So it is the right time for us, probably as a group, to think in terms of making, as I was mentioning to you, an executive brief to each and every head of government, those which are part of the movement and the CPTM, so there are about 51 countries, and probably will be based on not necessarily in writing about national security, because they may not be able to understand that it's not
Yes.
national security is about the country's security
Right.
as a whole, if they don't have this kind of visions. But we aim to do that this year,
Okay.
because otherwise I could see that national visions in a number of countries are kind of distorted and become dysfunctional. So thank you very much, Sheila, and on behalf
Welcome.
of our chairman and the board of directors and fellows and all the high commissioners. So we are going to be able to transmit this
Okay.
webcast, and of course part of the things that you think they can be made available to
Certainly.
as broad as possible. Okay? So, thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you.